Well, our next speaker is Ballew Neff. Emily is a Houston native, and she has just recently returned to Texas as the Kelso director, and that's the head dude, of the San Antonio Museum of Art. She has degrees from History of Art at Yale, a master's from Rice in art history, they reverse it there, and then a Ph.D. in the history of art at the University of Texas. She began her career at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, ultimately becoming the first department head for American painting and sculpture. From there, she went to the Fred Jones Museum of Art at the University of Oklahoma. And after that, she joined the Brooks Museum of Art in Memphis, where her leadership was transformative, ultimately leading to a decision to move the museum back downtown. She helped raise the money and reimagine the public engagement of that museum. Emily's professional career has an important part been devoted to placing American art in the greater context of global culture, and we're hoping that she will do that with Texas art in her role in San Antonio. So her speech today is Texas at the San Antonio Museum of Art, the Impressionist Impulse. Emily?
Hi, and thank you so much, Jeff. Give me just 1 second here because I tend to be, those of you who know me know I'm a talker, and so I want to be sure to be mindful of the time. So thank you so much for inviting me here to speak. I am honored. I received an invitation to do so on my first week on the job at SAMA. And having been away from Texas for over 8 years, and yes, I am so thrilled to be repatriated. I feel out of touch with the Texas art community and research and all of you. I feel like an interloper, and all of you have really greeted me warmly, and I appreciate it more than you know. So even though I'm rusty and not up to date on all of the research, I was thrilled to say yes to the invitation so that I would have the opportunity and a deadline to reconnect with the subject through the collections and histories of the San Antonio Museum of Art, where I now lead the institution. And I'm so sorry I missed all of you last night. Speaking of deadlines, I had to go out and get a thumb drive at Staples, so I was out sort of late and missed all the fun, but I fully intend to be one of those people at the bar at 11:30 tonight. I am aware that many of you probably or likely know a lot more about SAMA's history and San Antonio more broadly than I do. So this is going to be a refresher for many of you. And you may have noticed that Texas in my title has an exclamation point after it. And that was intentional on my part because I wanted to signal right away, this is not a scholarly talk. This is basically a romp through the SAMA's collections with Julian Onderdonk thrown in because I can't help myself. So I would be so grateful knowing that this is a very collegial, helpful, knowledgeable group if you would share your stories and insights about SAMA specifically and San Antonio more broadly as I get my feet on the ground and help to write the next chapter of the institution with a great team of curators, educators, and a great exhibitions team, and so forth. We'd really love to hear from you. And greetings from San Antonio. I hope you will come and visit us early and often, like voting. Now, what I do know, having now lived in San Antonio a whopping 4.5 months, is that San Antonio's art scene is very much alive, vibrant, and bustling. And it's a great place to see Texas art and in wonderful surroundings. So here you're at the Villa Finale in King William, once the home of Walter Nold Mathis. And I'm showing you, and this is of course in the King William district, and I'm showing you what I call the power wall of works by Julian Onderdonk with the Guadalupe pool in the center. Now, while you are in King William, you can just go practically down the street and around the corner, and you will be at the San Antonio Art League and Museum, which was founded in 1912. And I'm showing you just a few really poor snapshots from my iPhone of 3 works that are in the Edgar B. Davis collection of Texas art at that location. He, of course, the one who initiated the annual wildflower painting competitions, which brought people from all over the place to paint the Texas landscape. Edgar B. Davis making this possible in the 1920s, and you're looking at and I couldn't help but leave in the frames because, you know, these are all original packages, as we call them. A wonderful Dawson Watson at left, a Jose Arpa at upper right, a big field of verbena, absolutely spectacular, and down below Picking Cotton from 1929, also by ARPA, and I'll be returning to ARPA in a little bit. And of course, the Whitty, with its expansive collection of Texas art. So now you're going north on Broadway to the Whitty in what might be sort of roughly called Midtown. Although here in this photograph, I'm showing you a new installation that just went on view, in which you see people, landscape, wildlife, and livestock of Texas at the beginning of the 20th century by the little-known artist J. Ferdinand McCann, an Irish immigrant. And one of the reasons you may not know much about McCann is that his work has been in private collections, most notably the King Ranch. So this is a real rediscovery, and I highly encourage you to come see the show and read the glorious catalog by Mary Margaret McCallan. Now, we don't really associate Texas art per se with the McNay Art Museum, the first modern art museum in Texas, founded, of course, by Marion Kugler McNay. But you heard about it a little bit last night when Katie was talking about Charles Umlauf, so you remember that. And I'm showing you just a few little examples of some gems in the McNay collection, including a Seth Eastman sketchbook from 1848-49 with his sketch of the San Jose Mission. And then below, from the Fort Worth Circle, Kelly Faring from the 1950s. And that's just a couple of examples, and there are many more I could have included. And then, of course, at the San Antonio Museum of Art, which opened to the public in 1981, as you can see it today. Now, I know that CASETA's interest in Texas art ranged to about the 1980s or so, but I still would like to mention a few other sites in San Antonio that are truly exceptional and often include the work of contemporary Texas artists. Ruby City at upper left, one of the newest arrival museums in not just San Antonio, but in Texas. It's really spectacular, led by Elise Gonzalez. Blue Star Contemporary, led by Mary Heathcott at upper right, and led by Riley Robinson, Art Pace at the bottom. These are all essential institutions within San Antonio, among others. So while my focus today is reflective of CASETA's interests, I do think it's always good to recall a broader context when it comes to artistic production. So I'd like to acknowledge that what is now Texas housed astonishing rock art, and yes, I'm one of those rock art nerds, my sort of inner archaeologist. So this mural that you see at upper left is 2,000 to 4,000 years old at the White Shaman Preserve near Comstock, Texas, in the lower Pecos Canyon lands, home to spectacular rock art. So let's don't forget that, as well as the extraordinarily rich and exuberant movement of artworks in what was New Spain, parts of which, of course, are now known as Texas. And this was brilliantly demonstrated in SAMA's 2018 exhibition, San Antonio, 1718, honoring the 300th anniversary of San Antonio, is just a couple of examples. In other words, place may stay the same, but geographical and political boundaries shift. And the physical evidence in South Texas especially is visible in that regard, and very much in evidence in SAMA's collections, even though I won't be talking about those collections today. So in some ways, SAMA's building could be considered a work of art, albeit a difficult one requiring lots of conservation and repair. Our head of facilities calling it a great old lady. And it began its life as the Lone Star Brewing Company, the only adaptive reuse project in the country to have been converted from a brewery into an accredited art museum. So in case any of you forgot, San Antonio is fun. Anyway, it includes 2 great towers, crenellated parapets, and outbuildings for cooper and blacksmith shops, bottling facilities, and stables. And most, all but one of those, have since been rehabbed and refurbished and repurposed. It was built on Jones Avenue in the 1880s along the San Antonio River. And the vintage postcards that you see at the lower half of the print alert you to the tourism industry that has remained a core part of the San Antonio experience, and also hint at the extraordinary historic building stock that also remains a feature of the city. Now, after the adoption of Prohibition, this once thriving brewery obviously declined, and the building became home to a cotton mill, and over time it was an ice factory, an auto repair shop, and a uniform storage business, among other commercial ventures. Here are some interior shots of the brewery and the boiler rooms as it looked long ago, and how it looks today. And as I said, an adaptive reuse project that began in the 1970s with the acquisition of the derelict and abandoned property with Cambridge 7 architects out of Massachusetts and Overland Partners in San Antonio, over time defining an institution that is now a 13-acre campus with 105,000 square feet of building space for art, including exceptional collections of art of the ancient Mediterranean, thanks to primarily Gilbert Denman, Latin American art, thanks to the Rockefellers and the Winds, and Asian art, thanks to Lenora and Walter Brown, and with areas focusing on American art and contemporary art, including photography and Texas art under the umbrella of American art, and currently we're evaluating our African art, oceanic art, and arts of the Islamic world collections, which currently aren't on view but will be in the years to come. So in other words, we cover 5,000 years of art across many, if not all, continents, and we are the place in San Antonio and South Texas in which you can experience world cultures through art, and we take that very seriously in our mission and in our DNA. And this is an image from opening day. No ceremonial cutting of ribbon here. It was barbed wire. You can see them struggling with it. And Lila Cockrell broke not a ceremonial bottle of champagne, but a bottle of Lone Star. And here it is on the right when we opened. Now, the story of the collection is something that I am fairly certain most of you know better than I do, but we're going to go through it again. Eleanor Onderdonk, an extraordinary longtime curator at the Whitty and an artist in her own right, initiated a series of acquisitions that resulted in a very important collection of Texas art for the Whitty, established in 1926. Eleanor Onderdonk, of course, the daughter of Robert Jenkins Onderdonk, who is represented in our collection by 2 works. This one, a very rare nude, possibly his only nude. And in this painting, one of my very favorite Texas paintings in the collection, don't forget it in just a minute, from 1886, in which laundry never looked so good. And Eleanor's father, you will all remember, in the 1870s, became the city's first professionally trained art instructor, and he also taught Eleanor as well as Julian, and I'll return to Julian a little bit later. The other groundbreaking figure in the story, of course, is Cecilia Steinfeld, another long-term Whitty curator and possibly a great friend of many of you in the audience, who organized exhibitions and wrote catalogs on early Texas art and the Onderdonk family. And I'm showing here her book, Art for History's Sake, published in 1993, which I am told was used as a guide in helping to determine what Texas art went where when the San Antonio Museum Association, the parent organization of the Whitty, the Transportation Museum, and the San Antonio Museum of Art dissolved in 1995, and the collections were dispersed among the now stand-alone organizations. Art for History's Sake served as a guide to put the majority of more historic, quote-unquote, artworks at the Whitty, i.e. those that appeared in the catalog, and the majority of so-called fine art objects going to SAMA, a reasonable approach, but a line in the sand, so to speak, that was then and now somewhat blurred. When the collections were separated, there was one artist no one wished to relinquish rights to, and that was Julian Onderdonk. So the Whitty received first choice for its collection of Julian's work, and they, as you probably know, selected Onderdonk's Dawn in the Hills from 1922, the last painting Julian painted before his untimely death at the age of 40. So when it comes to Texas art, SAMA's story begins with those works assigned to them from the Whitty collection. So moving chronologically, it begins with a suite of early Texas furniture donated to the museum in 1992 by Houston collector Faith P. Bybee, a reminder of the German immigrant community flooding into Texas in the mid-19th century, bringing German furniture-making styles and practices with them. Here's a double-door food safe. And try to remember this because I'm going to show you something that relates to it in just a moment. This exquisite slant-top bureau desk from about 1880, this wardrobe from about 1865, high style from about the 1880s in this wardrobe, a settee from about 1860, as well as this adjustable daybed. And this is all based on a lot of research that Cecilia Steinfeld had done, among others, on early Texas furniture. And so the Bybee acquisitions were then enhanced by the purchase of Meyer pottery in the 1970s. And the Meyer pottery, as you probably know, founded in 1887 by Franz Schultz and his son-in-law William Meyer, German potters who, again, immigrated to Texas in 1885 and who had also previously worked for the pottery of William Sanger, also a German immigrant. And these are the ones that I hoped that you would remember. These are insect traps or ant traps. And so imagine that food safe and putting the legs of it, each one, in one of the inner cups. And then the outer one would be filled with water or kerosene to prevent ants or other critters climbing up the legs to get into your peach pie in the leg safe. And I just adore these modest little, very quotidian, day-to-day objects that probably people back then didn't think much of, but we think are rather extraordinary. Now, the mid-century story of Texas painting is greatly expanded by the gift of a large tranche of works by the French-born artist Jean-Louis Gentil, who traveled with French colonists to Texas with Count Henry Castro, founder of the Alsatian community of Castroville, and a surveyor and artist. Gentil is renowned for his gem-like small paintings that provide those extraordinarily detailed accounts of the life, the landscape, the customs of early settlers to Texas, and this one is called Stick Stock, and it's, again, about the subject of surveyors. And then we also have some incredible examples of so-called folk art or so-called outsider art in the Sama collection. It gives the collection a great deal of personality and character. We have a very large tranche of works by Eddie Arning. His personal story is quite tragic. He was mentally ill and spent 64 years of his life in institutions and hospitals. His artistic legacy is undisputed. I think you get a sense of it in these two works, one a stevedore and the other one Ted Williams' Blaze Orange. The other one that I'm going to give you an example of is one of my personal favorites, and here Houston also plays a role in this collection of works by Charles Delshaus. So those of you who are from Houston may know that Houston also has a great collection of Delshaus in the Menil collection. He was, again, another German immigrant. He was a retired butcher, and he was supposedly a former Sonora Aero Club member, which I will get to in just a minute, but he left a body of work of 2,500 drawings that were related to airships and the development of flight. And these had been stored in the attic of a home, a family home in Houston. And they were not discovered until the 1960s when they were dumped on a sidewalk and salvaged by a junk dealer after surviving a fire. So it's never been, and so it was just a treasure trove. These are truly remarkable objects. It's never been proven that a Sonora era club existed in Sonora, California during the gold rush, but clearly this is an artist who had an extraordinary imagination. And what he's doing in these collages is documenting the men and the machines that apparently they dreamed up in these secretive club meetings in which they were there to talk about men and the machines and the discussion of flight exploration. And I love the way the retired SAMA curator of contemporary art, Suzanne Weaver, describes them as Barnum and Bailey, Buck Rogers, and Jules Verne, all stirred together, and interspersed with collage pages, which Delshaus himself referred to as quote-unquote press blooms, featuring thousands of newspaper clippings related to either political events as well as the technological events of the period. We have a really big tranche of these, as does the Menil, and seek them out when you can. The next series of artworks I want to talk about really speak to the kind of vibrant network of artists and curators that tells us a lot about the camaraderie, mutual respect, and support, mutual support of a growing arts community in San Antonio and Texas more broadly. So here we have Eleanor Onderdonk giving in the 1960s one of these 1940s era glass pieces by the Bay City artist Forrest Bess. These wonderful, dreamlike, colorful, biomorphic forms evoking his interest, his deep interest in dream and imagery and the philosophy of the psychologist Carl Jung. And the artist always claimed that he was representing the patterns and visions he saw on the interiors of his eyelids. Baylor, I think you know, holds a larger collection and archive of the ceramicist Harding Black. SAMA also includes a large collection of his work. And in 1931, Black joined the Whitty Museum Archaeological Society, and this gave him access to the museum's collection of Native American pottery, and it marked his beginning of his great interest in working in clay. And he was basically self-taught, although he did study with Rudolf Staffel, his first pottery teacher, and he ended up teaching ceramic classes at the Whitty Museum in 1932. And he is known for his extensive glaze research and experimentation, and considered a pioneer of modern handmade pottery in Texas. And they're just exquisite. And if you have a chance to see on YouTube a PBS documentary about him, I think it's about a half hour and it's well worth your time. He also, with Georgiana Greer, rediscovered abandoned old potteries, many of them including the Wilson pottery, which was once owned by former enslaved people. And those are on best display at Biobend Collection and Gardens, and Bonnie can correct me or fill us in, but that was a remarkable discovery and a great, great acquisition to this day, and I love knowing that Harding Black had a hand in that. And we were talking about Octavio Medellin earlier this morning, you know, the very influential Mexican-American artist and teacher who really helped to shape Texas art for about 6 decades. And I can't wait to make time tomorrow to go see the show at the DMA. These are 2 works in Sama's collection that were given by Harding Black in memory of Eleanor Onderdonk. Again, the marvelous network of artists, curators, and collectors that have sustained us to this day. Medellin, of course, a student of Jose Arpa and Xavier Gonzalez. And in the world of glazed ceramics, while we're there, and to acknowledge the dying art of Mexican art tile factories revived in San Antonio and now known as the San Jose Workshop. This is a work, great example from the workshop, that not too long ago had been installed in a barbecue pit and was removed and conserved and is now at the San Antonio Museum of Art. And you can see examples of San Jose workshops all over the city of San Antonio. I'm going to give you just a few samples of some of the contemporary works in the collection. You can't do a talk on Texas art without acknowledging the importance of Dorothy Hood and a great painting from Sama's collection. And this is in honor of Susie Khalil, who will be giving us a deep dive into Kermit Oliver shortly. I'm very proud that we have a rather important one. This is a work by Marilyn Lanphier, and I bring it in and to show this scale for you. An artist who lived and worked in New York a great deal of time, but returned to her native San Antonio. And what you may not know about this work, called Uncle Clarence's 3 Wives, is that it is made up of thousands and thousands of vintage mother-of-pearl buttons, and she had 37 different volunteers and apprentices helping her. Took 2 years to do it, to find, clean, sort, whatever, and sew these mother-of-pearl buttons into this glorious series of tapestries. And, you know, when you first look at it and you think of the title, Uncle Clarence's 3 Wives, it's easy to perhaps be a little bit sexist and giggle a little bit. But then the story turns quite tragic. If you move from right to left, the wife on the far right, Aunt Jerry, was one of those World War II brief marriages. Aunt B is in the center with the family, and that was a marriage that lasted 45 years. But Aunt Billy at left died in the school explosion in New London, Texas, and Northeast Texas in 1937. To this day, one of the top 5 worst disasters in Texas history. And in photography, I show you a work by Early Hudnall from 1993 showing the kind of swagger of a hip-hop artist from one of Houston's historically black neighborhoods. I've always been a fan of Early Hudnall's work. I remember when his work came into the MFA Houston collection and was delighted to learn that Sama acquired its own. Now, in the last decade, under the leadership of Sama's former curator, William Rudolph, Sama really began making some targeted acquisitions in the area of Texas art, and this has given us great shape to that collection, something that we hope to continue. And this is a very sensitive and accomplished portrait by Jose Arpa, the Spanish artist from the area of Sevilla who worked in Mexico and Texas, specifically San Antonio. And so what William was able to do with the help of very generous donors, of whom I will mention in a moment, is to create a kind of nucleus of works by Jose Arpa, and you see both of them here, one on the far left with funds provided by the Lily and Roy Cullen Fund of one of his Mexico pictures, picturing a textile factory in Puebla, and at right, one of his Spanish pictures when he returned to Spain permanently in 1931. And this was purchased with funds provided by the Betty Steer and Kelso Foundation. And for those of you, and I was lucky enough to have met her before she died, she was one of the greatest friends of the institution in its history, and a very special friend in the area of Texas art, and I imagine she was a good friend of many of you. And we have benefited by the support, and you'll see it in the next few images that I show you, by the endowment fund that she has left to you, including one that we just purchased about 3 weeks ago. We were able to get, I say we, but William Rudolph did a great job stewarding these acquisitions, a work by Dawson Watson of the Spanish Governor's Palace in San Antonio, Texas, a very muscular painting by Everett Spruce. I did not bring in fact, it fell out, as did two of the works that I had in here, I'm not sure what happened, by Umlauf, that are now on view at the Umlauf Sculpture Garden, but Toni Lascelles, and Sue did such a brilliant job this morning on her talk about Toni Lascelles, and I hope you will remember seeing one of those that came from SAMA's collection, again, through the support of this endowment fund that allowed us to acquire quite a few in a relatively short period of time. And then this one, Clary MacDonald Williamson, The Harvest of 1954, Aunt Clara, as she became known in the art world, and she's often referred to as the Grandma Moses of Texas, but I like her work far more than I do Grandma Moses. She was virtually self-taught. Her reputation was built through Dallas Museum of Art's director and artist Jerry Bywaters, and thanks to the Kelso Endowment, we have a really, really great one. I hope you'll come see it. And more recently, again, getting into contemporary art, but letting you know that we are looking at that broader context, we just completed a major acquisition of 9 artworks by 8 San Antonio artists. You're seeing one at left by Liz Ward and the one on the right by Joe Harjo, and we're hoping to continue this effort of focusing in on our own community, which is just on fire. Now, I want to end by talking about Impressionism in Texas, particularly Julian Onderdonk. And you're looking at the Onderdonk studio. It's on the grounds of the Whitty Museum. It's absolutely beautifully sited there with other historic renovated buildings. And you will remember that the Onderdonks lived at 128 West French Place, which is basically midtown between Alta Vista and the St. Mary Strip. But the easiest way for you to remember it is that it's close to La Fonda, everyone's favorite place to get Mexican food. We know the familiar outlines of the story, how he was born to Robert Jenkins Onderdonk and Emily Gould Onderdonk in San Antonio. The Onderdonks had moved from Maryland to San Antonio at the urging of their dear friends, the Nagleys, who also played a major role in the founding of SAMA. Julian, of course, the brother to Eleanor. He learned painting from his father. He goes to the Art Students League in New York in 1901. Thereafter, kind of moving back and forth between San Antonio and New York. And like his father, they had the same teacher, William Merritt Chase, the towering figure of American art as well as teaching. And he was known, of course, for painting en plein air, painting out of doors, inspired by the French Impressionism and focusing on the light, color, and atmospheric effects of nature. And Onderdonk, of course, is best known, and this is the interior of the studio with the glorious landscape behind it overlooking the river. Onderdonk best known for bringing the landscape school of en plein air painting of the Shinnecock School where Chase had taught and where Onderdonk attended, bringing that to Texas. And that is true. That is his legacy. That is valid. I see it a little bit differently, though, which is that I believe that one of his great achievements in Texas cultural history is that he tapped into something that had been missing in the popular construction of Texas identity, something that was more subtle, quiet, and ultimately majestic, the Texas Hill Country, and the vibrant sense of place that it conveys to this day. And I couldn't help thinking about that vibrant sense of place that we saw just an hour ago with David Bates and his relationship to Grassy Lake. Chase's approach to landscape, which provided Onderdonk with what William Rudolph calls a toolkit to interpret his native landscape, really gave Onderdonk the means in which to explore his passionate relationship with South Texas as a painter, an extraordinarily observant naturalist, and even, I think, a kind of poet in painting. And I want to share this quote with you because I remember being struck by it when I went through the diaries of Emily Gould Onderdonk, his mother, long ago. And I think it shows how kind of, I know this is silly, but it does kind of show his sort of preternatural disposition that Julian Onderdonk had with the natural world. And she writes, when Julian was only one, she notes that he was, quote unquote, very fond of trees and water, and goes ooh, 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 ooh when he sees them. So I always think of that when I look at a Julian Onderdonk painting. This is the painting that I hope you'll remember when I showed you the Robert Jenkins Onderdonk painting of laundry and overlooking the San Antonio River, because you're bringing together building, river, and laundry. Obviously, these are father and son really good at that, and albeit in very different places. Obviously, we're here in New York City, and I just love the way that Onderdonk, that's a very compositionally complicated painting, and the way he takes us zigzagging into the distance through the pattern of the clotheslines. Really wonderful painting from his early New York period. And then we have a series in the collection of works from Long Island, showing more of a Barbizon inflected sensibility, inspired by Camille Corot and the American artist George Inness, and we know that Onderdonk described Inness as, quote unquote, an artist thoroughly in sympathy with nature, and that gives us a kind of sense of the direction that he would take. And the sense of color and brushwork sensibility is also at play here in this painting, October Day on Staten Island. You know that he lived on Staten Island. He actually had a short-term art school with Guy Pendabois, which always takes people by surprise, but it's true, with its flowing fall tones and these wonderful chromatic juxtapositions between gold, orange, and blue. In 1909, this is the time in which Onderdonk moves to San Antonio permanently, and he continues his work in New York, organizing the art exhibitions for the Dallas State Fair. This was incredibly important for Julian personally. It was incredibly important for the art world in Texas, because it gave him the funding that he needed. He was an artist who was always poor. It provided the funding for his career as a painter and to support his growing family. He had married Gertrude Shipman in 1902, and it also gave him the role of culture broker, selecting and bringing art across the nation to Texas, introducing Texans to then contemporary art, but it also gave him that opportunity to maintain his East Coast connections. That's extraordinarily important, something we may take for granted now because we're all connected through the internet and online, but back then it was a train ride and it was a much more cumbersome kind of experience, but essential to the art world in Texas. This is a scene from Castroville. I think it looks almost Dutch in its sensibilities. This painting, also in the collection, is especially reminiscent of William Merritt Chase and his Shinnecock landscapes, where Chase is out in that relatively flat landscape on Long Island and, had 9 children. And so those little toddlers dotting the field is very typical of those pictures. And this is sort of classic William Merritt Chase transferred to Sisterdale after he returned to Texas. And we know that this was painted at the home of Alfred Giles near Sisterdale. Their younger brother, Latrobe, had gone there to hunt, and Julian had gone there to paint. And as you know, it was very unusual for Julian Onderdonk to include figures in his painting, and soon after this moment of 1909, they begin to disappear altogether. And in fact, things begin to change more broadly. In the South Texas landscape he so loved, Onderdonk literally blossomed, coming into his own. And you can tell just from the first few paintings that I showed you, which are exquisite, that now he has hit his stride. His brushwork becomes much more assured, loose, less tightly controlled in a good way. He takes on bolder colors, a much more thoughtful observation and interpretation of the landscape. And it's all about those atmospheric conditions, like those of the Impressionists. That becomes the subject unto themselves, whether it's fog, twilight, driving rain. And here, one of those spectacular light displays from the big sky, hitting bluebonnets and cactus, and various trees with great intensity. And I'm only showing you oils because that's what we have in Sam's collection. But don't forget that he also used watercolor, pastel, and gouache, numerous media to get the kind of desired effects that he was hunting for. This I go to look at every day. It's a true masterwork in which you see the limestone ledges brilliantly hit by sunlight, that dramatic shadow play in the foreground and midground that makes your eyes dance across the canvas to that serene background which dissolves into lavender, and that wonderful tinted sky, which I hope you can tell from this image. And his trees, especially the one at far left, they begin to take on kind of the role of a character in a play almost in their own right. And I'd like to show you, two more. This from the same year as his untimely death at the age of 40, Onderdonk still at his peak, here combining the sweep of bluebonnets with the Caliche Road. The Caliche Road was also a favorite subject in his work as well. And this gives me the chance to tell you that that's something that's missing in our collection, a Caliche Road picture. I think those are absolutely brilliant, and it's almost like he intentionally found, the 104-degree day of the year to paint the Caliche, and the way the heat, you can just feel the heat as it reflects off the surface of the road. I do want to show you the work that we just acquired about 3 weeks ago by one of you. Thank you so very much. This is, and this image does not do it justice. We're going to have it photographed. It is a much more luminous, glowing canvas than appears here. And this takes us back to Onderdonk's early years from 1911. You ask us, don't you have enough Onderdonk? And the answer is never. But this one really appealed to us, and I really want to thank and acknowledge our Associate Curator of Contemporary Art, Lana Metter, for bringing it to my attention and helping to shepherd this acquisition through. Besides its strength as a painting, it appealed to us because it depicts a very specific site in San Antonio and captures one of the essential aspects of San Antonio identity that continues today. The military, the very, very strong military presence in our city is represented here by Fort Sam, so completely different from anything else we have in our collection. And I know Lana's been doing a lot of exciting research about the actual site itself. You can see the little campfire and the military tents next to it, and we have a very robust conversation going on about where exactly we are, taking into consideration that Fort Sam is rather flat, and this has a sort of wonderful topography. And are you looking towards Fort Sam? We don't think so, but we're not sure. And there was this one moment in which Fort Bullis, or what is now known as Fort Bullis, which is more near Leon Springs and Leon Valley, which we know was a place that Onderdonk loved to paint, was temporarily called Fort Sam. There was a moment where they had extended property, which was called Fort Sam, but now it's known as Fort Bullis. So I am hoping that every single one of you is going to set us straight, because I have a feeling you know the answer. But I just want to end here, again, with one of my favorite paintings in the collection, just as a way of summing up in different words what I think gets to the essence of Julian Onderdonk and his career. And it's actually an extended quote by the celebrated author John Graves. And John Graves is best known for his lyrical book, I hope you've read it, Goodbye to a River, which is about his love affair with the Brazos River. But he also wrote for landscape photographer Jim Bones in a book titled Texas Heartland, A Hill Country Year from 1975. And while I know John Graves was not writing about Onderdonk, I think he could have been in this quote, and I hope you agree with me. I think it's quite beautiful. When I was in college, John Graves writes, in the relatively innocent and provincial early 1940s, a group of us used to go for a long weekend every spring to a place on the Balcones Escarpment where a little river gushed out full size from big springs and ran clear and strong for a few miles before merging with the Guadalupe. It had steep cedar hills and fields gaudy with bluebonnets, and fish and boats and streamside cypress trees, and beer halls run by pleasant Germans, and everything else you could have wanted to have. And one day, while a few of us were lying on grass in the spring sun by the river, a friend of mine from Houston said something which, while not especially profound, has recurred to me often since. He said, "This is where everybody would like to come from." There isn't a soul in Texas that wouldn't have been born in these hills if he could have managed it. The hill country is revered as a sort of heartland by large numbers of Texans, even if they did not grow up there or anywhere nearby. And I think this is the power of Onderdonk. He translated what he saw and loved into one of the most eloquent and passionate tributes to a particular place ever, the hill country of Texas. Thank you. Yes, in the back.
I have a question. I have an anecdote. I was a confession. And welcome back to Texas.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to be back.
I attended one of the many celebratory openings when the word was repurposed into the museum. And I have a distinct memory of wandering through the new gallery, and I saw a woman standing by the elevator, and I thought to myself, I paid $500 to come to this private reception. Can't she get it together and wear something a little bit better than what she had on? It was very informal. Continued to look for the museum. Came back, she was still standing at the elevator. I realized at that point it was a Dwayne Hanson sculpture. And I've never forgiven myself as an art historian for being so upset.
I am so... Thank you for that story. I love it. I'm trying to, we have every piece of paper ever on the planet, but we don't have an archive. I mean, we're 40 years old, but if you include, we're still getting it together. And so I am grabbing everywhere I can these wonderful institutional history stories. I was at breakfast with Howard Taylor, who filled me in on a few things. And so I do really mean it. If you have stories like that, please share them with me. We're going to be focusing again on institutional history. We do have it, but it hasn't been organized and compiled quite in the same way that Dallas Museum and Museum of Fine Arts in Houston and other places have all of those stories organized. So thank you for that. Any other questions? All right.